What if I told you that in ancient Greece, being beautiful and male could be a death sentence? Forget everything you think you know about concubines. Most people imagine veiled women in silk, waiting behind palace walls in places like China or the Middle East. But in the heart of Western civilization, ancient Greece, it wasn't just women who were taken as concubines. Young boys, some barely past childhood, were forced into roles meant to entertain, seduce, and obey. And what's more shocking, this practice was not only accepted by society, it was celebrated by some of its most famous thinkers. In many ancient cultures, the elite members of society not only married wives, but also had concubines on the side, serving a dual purpose. First, to boost a man's prestige through a demonstration of his capacity to produce children, and of course, his limitless access to indulge in sexual desires. Records show that the tradition of taking in concubines was spread across the world. Many prominent figures in ancient Greece had one, or sometimes even two, concubines seated close by, as though they were ornaments in their private collection. However, what makes this even more fascinating and disturbing is the fact that there was a huge number of male concubines in ancient Greece. Male concubines were not the exception, they were often the norm. But beneath the silken robes, beautiful faces, and the illusion of opulence, there lay a sinister truth. Behind the closed doors of marble villas and banquet halls, male concubines were subjected to lives riddled with exploitation, cruelty, and sometimes even death. They were stripped of autonomy, silenced by shame, and used as instruments of pleasure for men of power. So was being a male concubine worth it? Let's find out. As mentioned, having concubines in ancient times was not unusual. It was often seen as the hallmark of a man's power, authority, and control over others. To keep concubines was not merely a personal choice, it was a public statement of status. In ancient Greece, relationships with concubines had little to do with love, affection, or mutual understanding. It was about power dynamics. The Greeks prized dominance and viewed the submissive role with disdain. Thus, for a man to keep concubines, even while married, was not shameful. As long as the man retained the dominant position in the relationship, society turned a blind eye. This is where the male concubine enters the picture, but not as an equal. These relationships were often between an older man and a much younger boy, frequently pre-adolescent or just entering puberty. The older male was the Erastes, the dominant, experienced mentor. The boy, referred to as a catamite or eromenos, was the submissive, the learner, and often, heartbreakingly, the victim. This entire structure formed the practice of pederasty, a widespread and controversial institution in ancient Greece. While some scholars of the time praised it as a form of intellectual and moral mentorship, others condemned it as outright exploitation masked by philosophy. At its core, pederasty was often transactional. The elder offered education, status, or gifts in exchange for sexual access. In some city-states, like Sparta, these arrangements were institutionalized and even celebrated. Boys were essentially handed over to older men to be guided, a term that too often blurred into manipulation and abuse. And yet, societal opinions varied. While such practices were embraced in certain places, other regions like Athens began pushing back. Laws were drafted to protect freeborn boys from overt sexual exploitation, but even these laws had glaring loopholes. For instance, adult male-to-male penetration was banned in Athens to preserve dignity, but penetrating a boy, that remained widely tolerated. These legal technicalities made it possible for abuse to flourish under the veil of mentorship and cultural tradition. The catamites were more than sexual companions. They were entertainers, often trained in music, dance, and poetry. They served wine at lavish symposia, recited verse, and were expected to please in more ways than one. And though they might be adorned in jewelry or fine clothing, they were, in essence, carefully groomed tools of gratification. Some were slaves. Others were sold into the role by desperate families hoping for social favor. Most had no choice. Worse still, some boys were castrated, intentionally mutilated, to prevent them from growing facial hair or developing deeper voices. The goal, to prolong their childlike beauty for as long as possible. They were dressed in feminine clothing, perfumed and styled to resemble girls. This grotesque practice wasn't isolated or rare. The term puer delicatus, a delicate boy, was used to describe slaves groomed exclusively for bodily satisfaction. Some were castrated not only to preserve their appearance, but also to mark them as permanent objects of submission. These acts were carried out not in secret, but often with society's silent approval or apathy. Such imagery is immortalized in artifacts like the infamous Warren Cup, a silver Roman drinking cup that graphically portrays sexual acts between older men and younger boys. To this day, it stuns modern viewers, not just because of its explicit nature, but because it was designed as a luxury item, a thing of pride. Freeborn boys, however, were given minor protections. They wore a toga praetexta, signaling their untouchable status. But this protection was only effective if the boy belonged to a family of influence. The average male concubine, a slave or foreigner, was entirely at the mercy of his dominus. The body of a slave had no civic identity. It was considered property, usable, discardable, violable. The elite were immune to prosecution when it came to their treatment of those below them. Laws like the Lex Scantinia made it illegal to rape freeborn citizens, but did nothing to protect those already considered objects. For these boys, consent was irrelevant. Their voices were swallowed by marble walls and gilded cages. Interestingly, the idea of gender in ancient Greece was far more fluid than many assume. Men cross-dressed, gods changed form. Gender roles were often flexible in ceremony and myth, even if rigidly enforced in real life. The Greeks didn't view sexuality through a binary lens as we do today. In many cases, it was the role played in the relationship, dominant or submissive, that mattered more than one's biological sex. This fluidity is personified in the god Hermaphroditus, born of Hermes and Aphrodite. He was a figure of duality, depicted with the beauty of a woman and the genitals of a man. His story is one of transformation. A water nymph, madly in love with him, begged the gods to unite them forever. The result was a single androgynous body, a symbol of the blending of male and female. From his name came the word hermaphrodite. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, is said to have taken male lovers and sometimes disguised himself in female form. In myth, gender was pliable. In society, however, power dynamics remained rigid, and being a passive partner, especially for a man, carried great stigma. That's why male concubines, despite their prevalence, were often shrouded in shame. They were needed but never honored. When Rome absorbed Greece, many of these practices continued under different names. Emperors took male lovers openly. Emperor Elagabalus even married a male athlete named Zoticus in a public ceremony. His flamboyance scandalized even the decadent Roman elite. And yet, such relationships persisted well into the early Roman Empire. But everything changed with the rise of Christianity. As monotheism took root, the old gods were swept aside. Jupiter, Mars, and Aphrodite were replaced by a single omnipotent god, and with him came a new moral order. The Codex Theodosianus, a set of laws created in the 4th century AD, explicitly banned homosexual unions and labeled same-sex behavior contrary to nature. Emperor Justinian I went further, criminalizing male-male intimacy as a capital offense. Under this new regime, the concept of the male concubine was not only obsolete, it was heresy. The practice was buried, along with the temples and statues of the old gods. What had once been celebrated was now condemned. The very boys who had once adorned banquet halls in silks were now seen as evidence of moral decay. In many ways, this was the only silver lining to the rise of Christianity, an end to the formalized exploitation of male bodies. But even this came at a cost. One form of repression replaced another. Love was not liberated. it was regulated, confined to strict heterosexual norms, and anything outside that was cast into darkness. So now we ask you, was being a male concubine in ancient Greece truly worth it?